Hello. So, welcome back everyone. We'll be doing chapter 3rd, prices and inflation under control of economic survey. This is the most shortest chapter I could find in the economic survey और आपके लिए भी सबसे आसान chapter है. Most of the themes that you will be seeing under this inflation chapter will be, और मैं आपको बता देता हूँ, आप उस हिसाब से फिर इस चीज़ में you will be getting clear indication of what will be important and what will be not. So we'll be talking about global inflationary situation, comparing it with India's inflationary situation. We'll be talking about various steps taken by Indian government as well as other regulatory body institutions to control inflation. And lastly, we'll see some of the ideas given by economic survey with respect to inflation and how do we proceed with respect to inflation. Okay, is this clear? Now let's discuss. I hope the screen is clearly visible. Screen में तो किसी को कोई दिक्कत नहीं है. चलो. Now let's start with first thing, which is low and stable inflation is the key to sustain economic growth. With the commitment of Reserve Bank of India as well as central government, we were successfully able to keep retail inflation at 5.4% in financial year 24. This is a very important metric that you guys please remember. India का inflation पिछले financial year में 5.4 रहा, और the projection with respect to the next financial year, that means the current financial year, is how much given by RBI. RBI ने कितना दिया inflation का projection? Just now we studied in the current affairs session also. Anyone? It is 4.5%. Chalo. Next is India's retail inflation comparison with emerging market, developing economies as well as the global average. So if you see the data given by IMF in World Economic Outlook, it says that India inflation was lower than the global average as well as that of emerging market and developing economies. So you could see the data. This is India's inflationary data. Emerging market wala sabse zyada hai. Then you have the global average and then India's. And lastly, one more correlation the economic survey wants you to know is that ironically the per capita income does not have a positive correlation with respect to inflation. That means किसी भी कंट्री का अगर पर कैपिटा इनकम ज़्यादा है, उस कंट्री में इन्फ्लेशन उल्टा ही है, कम है. Whereas the countries where per capita income is low, the inflation is usually higher. And that is reflected in this graph. As you can see, advanced economies में inflationary tendencies were the lowest, whereas emerging market and developing economies में inflationary tendencies were at the highest. So this you can quote as an analysis in context of inflationary conditions. Factors that were contributing to effective management of inflation: established monetary policies, well-developed efficient markets, and lastly stable currencies. These contribute to India's effective inflation management. Please make sure that you remember all of these three clearly. And this is comparison with global average. If you see India's inflation management, it is the second lowest deviation from the global average. As you can see, बाकी सारी countries में कितना ज़्यादा inflation है, but not in India as well as in South Africa. As India's inflation deviation was just 1.4 percentage points below global average. So that 1.4 you need to remember. 5.4 you need to remember. ठीक है, ये सारी चीज़ें आप याद करके चलिए. Objective purpose के लिए those key figures are important. Next is domestic retail inflation. So retail inflation, all of you understand CPI combined की बात कर रहे हैं हम लोग. So CPI combined में food inflation is at the top, and we will see various trends with respect to that. So first thing is higher food inflation while core inflation remained moderate. This is the first factor that we could see. Russia-Ukraine war led to price pressures क्योंकि supply chain disruption हुआ, supply कम हो गया, और जब supply कम हो जाता है तो supply cost push inflation increases. Next is domestically excessive heat in the summer as well as uneven rainfall put pressure on the food prices. These are the reasons that led to increase in inflation in the country, specifically the retail inflation. And what were the various steps taken by the government to decline or to reduce inflation? First of all, central government announced price cut for LPG. तो आपका बेसिकली ट्रांसपोर्ट का ही कॉस्ट रिड्यूस कर दिया, विच इज अ इनपुट फॉर मोस्ट ऑफ द इंडस्ट्रीज, तो ओवरऑल सप्लाई का भी कॉस्ट रिड्यूस हो गया. सिमिलरली वी विटनेस्ड ग्लोबल एनर्जी प्राइस रिडक्शन एज वेल एज ग्लोबल कमोडिटी प्राइसेस रिडक्शन. दिस हेल्प्ड अस in reducing import cost. And lastly, monetary policy increase from by 250 basis points. 4% से 6.5% हो गया. That also reduced the liquidity in the system. That further reduced the inflation, which is reflected by the impact. As you can see, the core inflation declined to 3.1%, and retail inflation as of June 2024 is at 5.1%. And this is June की बात चल रही है, पिछले फाइनेंशियल ईयर में तो 5.4% था ही. Now we'll talk about core inflation particularly. So core inflation is what? If I may ask to anyone, core inflation, if you want to calculate from CPI combined, so what type of inflation you need to reduce from retail inflation or headline inflation? So basically you need to remove the inflation which is highly volatile, which is food as well as fuel. That gives you core inflation. And in core inflation you see core goods, core services, and core consumer durables and core non-durables. Consumer durables basically like clothing, cars, all those durable goods. So we'll see one by one. In financial year 24, if you see, the price situation improved. We saw the reasons. Commodity prices declined, oil prices declined, and CPI inflation moderated. Similarly, even core inflation also went to a 9-year low in financial year 24. So this you need to have a broad understanding of decline in inflation. And if you see core consumer durable inflation, which includes clothing, it witnessed an increase of 5 percentage points. So that was the issue. Whereas non-durables, it witnessed steep decline. And if we particularly focus on food inflation, we saw two broad trends. First trend is obviously the value of food inflation. So you see, because the agriculture sector was affected by extreme weather events, food inflation crossed 7.5% in financial year 24. So please remember this number, highly important for Nabard people. Please make sure that you remember this. While overall CPI was 5.4%, food inflation was 7.5%. And these are the reasons for increased price pressure in the major food items, because all of you understand unfavorable conditions, seasonal changes, crop diseases, monsoon and rainfall impact. Monsoon में क्या होता है, या तो ये monsoon ज़्यादा intensity से हो रहा है या बिल्कुल हो ही नहीं रहे. Drought like conditions are there. Sowing delays and dry spells. All these reasons has led to increased price pressure on food products. Now the next thing is, if all these were putting price pressures on those food products, administrative measures taken by central government in context of different crops, how did it help reduce those price pressures? Basically, in all the different crops, you guys will see same type of initiative to be done in different crops. तो आपको एट दी एंड वो 4-5 चीजें याद करके रखनी है जो सेंट्रल गवर्नमेंट अपने एंड पे कर सकती है, ठीक है, जिसके थ्रू वो प्राइस को कंट्रोल कर सके, इन्फ्लेशन को कंट्रोल कर सके. सो एज यू कैन सी इन दिस कॉन्टेक्स्ट, एक्सपोर्ट वर प्लेस्ड अंडर प्रोहिबिटेड कैटेगरी. दिस इज टू नॉट लेट द सप्लाई ऑफ प्रोड्यूस गो आउटसाइड. तो सप्लाई बनाए रखने के लिए हम लोगों ने एक्सपोर्ट बंद कर दिया. टू प्रिवेंट होर्डिंग एंड स्पेकुलेशन, स्टॉक लिमिट्स वर इम्पोज्ड कि कोई इससे ज्यादा अमाउंट अपने पास नहीं रखेगा. They also introduced भारत आटा एट अ सब्सिडाइज्ड प्राइस टू मेक इट अफोर्डेबल फॉर कंज्यूमर्स. तो सरकार खुद बेच रही है. सो दिस naturally increases supply in the market, which also reduces price pressures. And lastly, these are offloaded periodically from central pool under open market sale. तो अगर मैं आपसे पूछूं, all of these are supply side measures where the government is first of all putting it into the market via open market sale or selling it via some brand name. ये दो चीज हो गई डायरेक्ट सप्लाई की. एक चीज हो गई कि सप्लाई को बाहर नहीं जाने देना है, तो यू पुट एक्सपोर्ट लिमिट्स. ऑल्सो कोई होल्ड करके ना रखे, यू ऑल्सो पुट होल्डिंग लिमिट्स और स्टॉकिंग लिमिट्स. These are the 4 type of steps being taken by the central government across all the different crops. अगर आपसे इन्फ्लेशन के steps पूछे जाए, what can be done? So you quote central government, put for these 4 steps. You quote RBI, put different steps that RBI usually takes to reduce liquidity. Is this clear to everyone? किसी को कोई दिक्कत? Does anyone have any issue with respect to understanding any of the aspect previously? Chalo, we'll move further. So global food prices and domestic inflation we'll be talking about, particularly in context of edible oils, because this is one of the most important commodity that we import a lot from outside. As you see, the edible oil market heavily depends upon imports, with more than 50% of the total oil requirements being imported. Okay? And as you see, the Food and Agricultural Organization edible oil price index tells us about what is the situation of inflation in edible oils. तो अभी recently हमने देखा कि उसमें decline हुआ है. That is what the reason for decline in domestic edible oil prices. वरना इसके चक्कर में तो और inflation हो जाता. Again, the government steps are National Mission on Edible Oils, in which government wants to enhance palm oil production to reduce import burden. Similarly, in case of sugar also, the government announced restriction on export in June to ensure sufficient local supplies. Again, the same thing has been utilized as we've discussed in the previous case कि central government के पास 4-5 steps हैं that you can write in inflation what they want to do. And this is the movement of prices as you can see. Edible oil में भी decline we've seen, sugar में भी decline we've seen. And this is the interest rate variation in retail inflation. So this is the map of India in which you can easily identify different states that have crossed inflation, headline inflation more than 6%. ये जो orange वाले हैं, राजस्थान, हरियाणा, उड़ीसा, तेलंगाना, त्रिपुरा, as well as Mizoram, no, sorry, Manipur. these are the regions or these are the states where you could see inflation more than or equal to 6%. ठीक है, तो you can remember this, I've already put it. Whereas rest of the country were having inflation less than 6%. And if you see interstate variation in inflation, and it says that it was pronounced more in rural areas. And why is it so? Why do you think inflation was more pronounced in rural areas as compared to urban areas? Anyone? What do you think? What could be the reason? So basically, whenever you try to calculate inflation of any particular commodity, you need to have a basket of commodities. जैसे आप CPI inflation भी करते हो, उसमें बहुत सारी चीज़ें आप put in करते हो. Similarly, हम rural areas का CPI basket देखेंगे और urban areas का देखेंगे, तो CPI में food का component is more in rural than urban. Food inflation was actually high, because of which CPI was high. अब फूड इन्फ्लेशन हाई होगा तो रूरल वाले एरिया में नेचुरली इन्फ्लेशन विल बी मोर एज कंपेयर टू द अर्बन एरिया. सो दैट्स व्हाट द रीजन दैट इकोनॉमिक सर्वे सेज दैट बिकॉज ऑफ द हायर वेटेज ऑफ फूड आइटम्स देन अर्बन एरियाज, रूरल एरियाज विटनेस्ड मोर इन्फ्लेशन. So this was with respect to urban and rural. Again, next thing was the areas which have more rural areas, वहाँ पर हम लोगों ने inflation ज़्यादा देखा as compared to the less. So that's why you see Haryana at the top, Goa at bottom. Lastly, outlook and way forward. In outlook, the economic survey mentions about different organizations projection with respect to inflation. So in which it first talked about RBI's projection, which says 4.5% in financial year 25 and 4.1% in financial year 26, whereas IMF projected 4.6 in 24, 4.2 in 25, and World Bank says 3% decline in commodity prices, 4% decrease in 2025. And economic survey with respect to outlook says कि energy price index is expected to reduce, fertilizer price are also expected to reduce, whereas base metal price will increase, and overall the current downward movement in the prices of commodities is a positive outlook. All these things you can quote as a reason behind which RBI says that inflation will reduce to 4.5%. आप केवल लिख दोगे RBI ने ये सोचा, but you will not give the reasoning behind it, then it would not make sense. Lastly, long-term ideas provided by economic survey which you can utilize for descriptive. जब भी आपको inflation के context में way forward या solutions लिखने हैं, then you utilize such kind of material from economic survey, which is, as you can see, it says the reversing domestic consumption of edible oils and stabilize domestic prices, in which survey recommends कि जो नेशनल मिशन है आप उसको पाम ऑयल के अलावा और भी एडिबल ऑयल सीड्स को इंक्लूड करो, सो दैट जितना भी हम लोग इंपोर्ट कर रहे हैं वो भी रिड्यूस हो जाए. नेक्स्ट इज टैकलिंग परसिस्टेंट डेफिसिट इन पल्सेस एंड कॉन्सिक्वेंट प्राइस प्रेशर्स. इट सेज कि पल्सेस का प्रोडक्शन फ्यू स्टेट्स में कॉन्सेंट्रेटेड है, तो आप उसको डिस्ट्रीब्यूट करो, क्योंकि इन केस अगर बाढ़ आ गई एक पर्टिकुलर एरिया में तो आपका पूरा पल्सेस का प्रोडक्शन हिल जाएगा कि पूरे कंट्री में इस जगह से आ रहा है, पल्सेस इधर से आ रहे हैं, बट बिकॉज हियर सम डिजास्टर हैपेंड, नाउ ओवरऑल कंट्री में पल्सेस का इन्फ्लेशन हो रखा है. सो दैट्स व्हाई इट इज इंपॉर्टेंट फॉर रीडिस्ट्रीब्यूशन ऑफ प्रोडक्शन ऑफ पल्सेस अक्रॉस द कंट्री. Next is improving storage and processing facilities for vegetables to not let them rot and reduce in supply, because नीति आयोग वाला भी आपने सुना होगा कि how much percentage of the food gets wasted in the country because of which supply reduction happens. Most important reason for inflation. Lastly, complete clarity on prices and their indices. तो वो कैसे करेंगे? वो करेंगे by monitoring high frequency data. So it says that the high frequency monitoring data for essential food items collected by different departments should be linked in such a way that the buildup of prices at each stage from the farm gate to final consumer is quantifiable and monitorable. Basically आप किसान के यहाँ से रिटेलर तक के बीच में जितने जितने स्टेप्स हैं, हर एक स्टेप पर अगर प्राइस मॉनिटर कर पाए, this will enable you to identify at which position the price increase is happening. Then you can take exactly those kind of steps. That's what economic survey is telling you to do. Lastly, the ongoing efforts to construct producer price index for goods and services should be increased, and considering the results of household consumption expenditure survey, it should be prudent to revise consumer price index with fresh weight and item basket. मतलब उनका रिवीजन कर लीजिए, क्योंकि 2011 का 11-12 का बेस लगा हुआ है उसमें, और फिर उसके बाद वेट्स एंड मेजर्स उस समय के हिसाब से लगे हुए हैं. आज के हिसाब से आप वेट्स एंड आइटम बास्केट्स चेंज करिए, ऑल्सो बेस ऑल्सो प्लीज चेंज. सो दैट्स व्हाट द whole inflation chapter was all about in context of economic survey. Again, I'm telling you, most of the data which is highlighted by yellow in the document, you need to remember those only for objective purposes. बाकी जो descriptive के लिए लिखा है, I have already specifically mentioned what is important for descriptive and what is not. ठीक है? So that is from my end. If you have any question, feel free to ask. Otherwise, we'll wind up this session. Don't worry, Vanchika. No, that's what I'm trying to do. But again, I'm saying, please do not wait for the lectures, because utilize lectures for revision purposes. You guys have already received PDF. Try to complete PDF on your end, and then yes, Shreya, chapter 3 is completed. And then you can utilize the lectures for revision purposes. Okay, but I will complete it before Nabard exam only. Don't worry. Okay. Chalo, thank you guys for joining. We'll meet in the next session. Till then, keep revising these different documents.